Chapter 10 The Happy Home. One important result of brush with the pirates on the lagoon was that it made the Redskins their friends. Peter had saved Tiger Lily from a dreadful fate, and now there was nothing she and her braves would not do for him. All night they sat above, keeping watch over the home, over the ground, and awaiting the big attack by the pirates, which, obviously, would not have been much longer delayed. Even by day they hung out, smoking the pipe of peace and looking almost as if they wanted little bits to eat. They called Peter the Great White Father, prostrating themselves before him, and he liked this tremendously, so that it was not really good for him. The Great White Father, he would say to them in a very lordly manner, as they groveled at his feet, is glad to see the Pickaninny warriors protecting his wigwam from the pirates. Me, Tiger Lily, that lovely creature would reply. Peter Pan saved me, his very nice friend. Me no pirates hurt him. She was far too pretty to cringe in this way, but Peter thought it was a due, and he would answer condescendingly, "It is good, Peter Pan has spoken." Always when he said Peter Pan has spoken, it was meant to show that now shut up, and they accepted it humbly in their spirit. But they were by no means so respectful as the boys, who then looked up upon just ordinary braves. They said "how do" to them, and things like that, and what annoyed the boys was that Peter seemed to think that was all right. Secretly, Wendy sympathized with them a little, but she was far too loyal a housewife to listen to any complaints against Father. Father knows best, she always said, whatever her private opinion must be. Her private opinion was that the Redskins should not call her a squaw. We have now reached the evening that was to be known among them as the Night of Nights, because of its adventure and their upshot. The day, as if quietly gathering its forces, had been almost uneventful, and now the Redskins in their blankets were at their posts above, while below the children were having their evening meal, all except Peter, who had gone out to get the time. The way you get the time on the island was to find the crocodile. They stayed near him till the clock struck. The meal happened to be a make-believe tea, and they sat around the board guzzling and greed, and what really was their chatter and recriminations, the noise, as Wendy said, was positively deafening. To be sure, she did not mind noise, but she simply would not have them grabbing things and then excusing themselves by saying that Toodles had pushed their elbow. There was a fixed rule that they must never hit back at meals, but should refer to the matter of the dispute to Wendy by raising the right arm politely, saying, "I complain of so-and-so." But what usually happened was that they forgot to do this and did it too much. "Silence," cried Wendy, when for the 20th time she had told them that they are not to all speak at once. "Is your mug empty, Slightly darling?" "Not quite empty, Mummy," Slightly said, after looking into an imaginary mug. "He hasn't even begun to drink his milk," Nibs interposed. This was telling, and Slightly seized his chance. "I complain of Nibs," he cried promptly. John, however, had held his hand up first. "Well, John, may I sit in Peter's chair as he is not here?" "Sit in Father's chair, John?" Wendy was scandalized. "Certainly not." "He is not really our father," John answered. "He didn't even know how Father does till I showed him." "This is grumbling." "We complain of John," cried the twins. Toodles held up his hand. He was so much the humblest of them. Indeed, he was the only humble one, that Wendy was especially gentle with him. "I don't suppose," Toodles said indifferently, "that I could be Father." "No, Toodles." Once Toodles began, which was not very often, he had a silly way of going on. "As I can't be Father," he said heavenly, "I suppose, Michael, you would let me be the baby." "No, I won't," Michael rapped. He was already in a basket. "As I can't be baby," Toodles said, getting heavier and heavier and heavier, "do you think I could be a twin?" "No, indeed," replied the twins. "It's awfully difficult to be a twin." "As I can't be anything important," said Toodles, "would any of you like to see me do a trick?" "No," they all replied. "I hadn't really any hope," he said. The hateful telling broke out. "Slightly is coughing on the table." The twins began with cheesecakes. "Curly is taking both butter and honey." "Nibs is speaking with mouthful." "I complain of the twins." "I complain of Curly." "I complain of Nibs." Oh dear," cried Wendy. "I'm sure I sometimes think that spinsters are to be envied." She told them to clear away and sat down to her work basket, a heavy load of stockings, and every knee with a hole in it, as usual. Wendy remonstrated. "Michael, I'm too big for a cradle." "I must have somebody in a cradle," she said almost tartly, "and you are the littlest. A cradle is such a nice homely thing to have about a house." While she sewed, they played around her, such a group of happy faces and dancing little limbs, up by the romantic fire. It had become a very familiar scene, this, in the home under the ground, but we are looking on it for the last time. There was a step above, and Wendy, you may be sure, was the first to recognize it. "Children, I hear your father's step. He likes you to meet him at the door." Above, the Redskins crouched before Peter. "Watch well, braves, I have spoken." And then, as so often, the children dragged him from the tree. He had brought nuts for the boys, as well as the correct time for Wendy. "Peter, you just spoiled him, you know," Wendy simpered. "Ah, old lady," said Peter, hanging up his gun. "It was me told him mothers are called old lady." Michael whispered to Curly. I complain of Michael, said Curly instantly. The first twin to Peter. First, we want to dance. Dance away, my little man, said Peter, who was in high good humor. But we want you to dance. Peter was really the best dancer among them, but he pretended to be scandalized. Me, my old bones would rattle. And Mummy, too. What? Cried Wendy. The mother of such an armful dance. But on a Saturday night, Slightly insinuated. It was not really a Saturday night. At least, it may have been, for they all had long lost count of the days, but always, if they wanted to do anything special, they said it was a Saturday night, and then they did it. Of course it is Saturday night, Peter, Wendy said, relenting. People of our figure, Wendy. But it is only among our own children. True, true. So they were told they could dance, but they must put on their nighties first. Ah, old lady, Peter said aside to Wendy, warming himself by the fire and looking down at her as she turned to heel. There is nothing more pleasant of an evening for you and me, when the day's toil is over, to rest by the fire with the little ones nearby. It is sweet, Peter, isn't it? Wendy said, frightfully gratified. Peter, I think Curly has your nose. Michael takes after you. She went to him and put her hand on his shoulder. Dear Peter, she said, with such a large family, of course, I have now passed my best. But you don't want to exchange me, do you? No, Wendy. Certainly, he did not want to change, but he looked at her uncomfortably, blinking, you know, like one not sure whether he was awake or asleep. Peter, what is it? I was just thinking, he said, a little scared. It is only make-believe, isn't it, that I am their father? Oh, yes, Wendy said primly. You see, he continued apologetically, it would make me seem so old to be their real father. But they are ours, Peter, yours and mine. But not really, Wendy, he asked anxiously. Not if you don't wish it, she replied, and she distinctly heard his sigh of relief. Peter, she asked, trying to speak firmly, what are your exact feelings to me? Those of a devoted son, Wendy. I thought so, she said, and went and sat by herself at the extreme end of the room. You are so odd, he said, frankly puzzled, and Tiger Lily is just the same. There is something she wants me to be, but she says it is not my mother. No, indeed it is not, Wendy replied, with frightful emphasis. Now we know why she is prejudiced against the Redskins. Then what is it? It isn't for a lady to tell. Oh, very well, said Peter, and little nettled. Perhaps Tinker Bell will tell me. Oh, yes, Tinker Bell will tell you, Wendy retorted scornfully. She is an abandoned little creature. Here, Tink, who was in her bedroom eavesdropping, squeaked out something imprudent. She says she glories in being abandoned, Peter interpreted. He had a sudden idea. Perhaps Tink wants to be my mother. You silly, cried Tinker Bell in a passion. She had said it so often that Wendy needed no translation. I almost agree with her, Wendy snapped. But she had been much tired, and she little knew what was to happen before the night was out. If she had known, she would not have snapped. None of them knew. Perhaps it was best not to know. Their ignorance gave them one more glad hour, and as it was to be their last hour on the island, let us rejoice that there were 60 glad minutes in it. They sang and danced in their nightgowns. Such a deliciously creepy song it was, in which they pretended to be frightened at their own shadows, little witting that soon the shadows would close in upon them, from whom they would shrink in real fear. So uproariously they danced, and how they buffeted each other on the bed and out of it. It was a pillow fight rather than a dance, and when it finished, the pillows insisted on one more bout, like partners who know that they may never meet again. The stories they told before it was time for Wendy's good-night story. Even Slightly tried to tell a story that night, but the beginning was so fearfully dull that it appalled not only the others but himself. And he said it happily. Yes, it is a dull beginning, I say. Let us pretend that it is the end. And then, at last, they all got into bed. For Wendy's story, the story they loved best, the story Peter hated. Usually, when she began to tell the story, he left the room or put his hands over his ears, and possibly, if he had done either of those things this time, they might have still been on the island. But tonight, he remained on the stool, and we shall see what happened.